Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Weisberger, the CEO of CoinRoutes. It is Friday, July 14th, 2023, and it's time for This Week in Crypto. And we had a lot of news this week, a couple of really big stories that I'm going to focus on. But let's talk first about the markets, which have been interesting, but not a whole lot actually when it comes to the big caps. So Bitcoin earlier today was up about 2% for 7 days. Now it's around flat for the last week. Ethereum earlier today was up around 5%. Now it's up about 2%, all in the same kind of week when NASDAQ and the S&P have been up a little bit, but kind of fizzled out today. The Russell's down a bit today. The only real movers in the market, though, are coins like XRP, for the reasons we're going to discuss in just a second, Solana, Polygon, etc., which have all seen significant double-digit moves. So what's the first piece of news we're going to talk about is the XRP decision. And I headlined this decision, the judge got it right. In point of fact, if you look at what the judge decided, it's actually fascinating that there was nobody who actually argued for this particular decision. But what she basically said was XRP, when used to fund Ripple, sold to institutional investors for that purpose, was likely to be and can go to trial as an unregistered security sale. But XRP trading as a network from people trading either programmatically or on exchange in the secondary markets was not subject to SEC oversight. And that is extremely important. That has bunches of implications. The most important implication on this particular news story is that the clown show, which we've had people complaining or stating, having people from central casting come in to the Congress and saying, we don't need new securities laws. We don't need new laws for crypto. We have enough laws to do everything the way we want to do it. It's clearly a pile of crap. And we kind of understand that it's a pile of crap, both because these things are not securities. No one has jurisdiction. No one can agree on it. And in fact, as soon as this came out, various people in Congress essentially said, this shows why Congress needs to legislate. Cynthia Lummis was probably the loudest, but we're going to talk about her bill in a second, because that's the second biggest news story. But the other implications are, first, that the Coinbase case is now going to be dramatically affected. Now, one judge is not dispositive, but the entire idea of secondary trading of tokens that are clearly decentralized and not being sold just because of one particular firm, in this case Ripple, probably does spill over to most of the tokens, if not all of the tokens, that the SEC claimed Coinbase was trading knowingly as unregistered securities. That claim has always been a bunch of crap, and Coinbase's response, which we talked about last week, is fairly clear on that they've changed the rules. But considering the courts are calling it into question and people in Congress are specifically stating that they need to legislate in order for jurisdiction to be assigned, it's quite clear that Coinbase is going to have a pretty strong argument as it moves forward. The last thing that needs to be stated is this does not provide clarity in the sense of, okay, now we can innovate in the United States, everything is safe. What it does is it means that during the period of time that it's going to take the SEC to appeal it, in all likelihood, that people who are doing things such that is in the secondary trading, not funding enterprises by selling non-dilutive equity in the form of tokens or non-dilutive capital in the form of tokens, but secondary trading is probably going to be okay. It really depends on how you look at it and where it goes. Obviously, you're going to have to defend yourself. The SEC still seems litigious. But the reality is this is becoming a political albatross for the SEC. And so the title of this piece is, I agree with Gary somewhat. And that's because I do agree that if an organization uses a token that confers no economic rights to the recipients to fund their operations, arguably that should be regulated. But where I disagree with Gary is the fact that the disclosures that the SEC requires on securities are completely inadequate for token sales. Now, we see this in absolute spades. And the second biggest news story this week, Mr. Alex Mashinsky, the former CEO of Celsius, essentially doing the perp walk, being arrested and charged with criminal fraud by the DOJ. At the same time, the SEC, of course, said, me too, me too, me too. And, they're going to do a civil fraud case at the same time. But, they remind me of the little kid in the back of the room saying, I know the answer, I know the answer. But the reality is the DOJ is the real deal. And that particular point proves a few things. The first thing it proves is we don't need new laws for fraud. If you lie and commit fraud, you can be punished. And in all likelihood, if the case is strong, will be punished to the fullest extent of the law. It also shows very clearly how incredibly late the SEC is. They don't do anything to protect investors in the crypto world. They simply go after people after somebody else has done the heavy lifting, which, of course, is exact opposite of what you want them to do. But the third point, the point that goes straight into what I was saying a few seconds ago, is it proves the need for disclosures. Because had Cell had to have disclosed their full supply schedule, all insider sales of that by the people who were originally awarded them, the tokenomics of the Cell token, and all the relevant information investors should need, then when Mashinsky was donating or giving tokens to his wife, for example, that would have been seen. And if it wasn't seen, the SEC, had they been overseeing it, or the CFTC, whoever's overseeing it, have been able to prosecute on the basis of fraud far, far earlier. Not after investors lost boatloads of money, but before. See the difference? Before is better. After is locking the barn door after the horse is bolted. So if we were serious about regulating crypto, and I agree with Gary Gensler when he says that we should have a cop on the beat, great. But then the cop on the beat needs to have information. And that information means he needs to craft new rules, which are actual disclosures that the industry would agree are ones that token investors would want to see, such as the supply schedule, who owns them, such as the release schedule, lockup periods, such as future minting and what can be done, such as tokenomics, what are the obligations that are conferred, obligations and or benefits to being a token holder, and also any insider sales from that aforementioned supply schedule. Those are all obvious things that if you actually disclosed, you could prevent a lot of tomfoolery. But sadly, we don't have that. So what's the third news story is actually an attempt by the Senate now to rectify this problem. So Cynthia Lummis and Kristen Gillibrand reintroduced a bill. And their bill, while I have issues with it, shows very, very strongly that now we have the House and the Senate saying we need to do something in crypto regulation. We are tired of driving innovation offshore. We are tired of driving American consumers to use those unregulated offshore platforms. Instead, let's do something to actually have ground rules that we can all live with. Now, in their particular case, it disagreed with the House. The House, interestingly enough, despite being Republican, did have authority and power to the SEC. In the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, it's almost exclusively with the CFTC. Without regard to which alphabet soup of agency is responsible for what is important are the things that it allows and what it doesn't do. Now, there were, in my opinion, 4 different things in the bill that are worth talking about. I don't want to spend an enormous amount of time on it, but the first one is it forces stablecoin issuers to be banks. Now, I'm sure Circle would argue that that's not a good idea, but the fact of the matter is having the regulatory oversight to prove reserves matters. And a stablecoin that is fully backed should have an audited financial system, and there should be regulations to make sure that they are not doing anything untoward with those reserves. So whether it has to be banking regulation or something like that, that seems like a good idea. And I think that most people agree with the concept, if not the specifics. The second is it puts spot crypto exchanges under the CFTC, which is fine in a sense because a regulator should be able to oversee this. But the issue there would be, does the CFTC force what is very heavily intermediated market onto spot crypto, i.e., do you need to have DCMs and FCMs? Can an exchange directly sell to the public, etc.? I think with the appropriate rule set that works with crypto with less need for intermediation, it can work, but it's not clear from the outset. The third is it requires something which I think we all agree with on the surface, which is strict division of labor between custodial services and exchange matching services. And that definitely makes sense in practice. We get it. But the question really is it really that bad to have the common ownership between the two? So is Coinbase necessarily problematic if their custody is walled off on an information barrier basis from their exchange, and if their custodian has reporting requirements and attestations that that things won't be done in a way to be influenced by the others? The conflicts of interest can be managed. The notion that we have to recognize those conflicts of interest is exceedingly important. The notion that there has to be strict ownership walls, not so sure. But once again, I'm quibbling. It is something that's important. And the last thing is the bill bans rehypothecation entirely, which it's well intentioned, and I understand where it's coming from. It's coming from Caitlin Long whispering in Cynthia Lummis's ear. It makes it much more restrictive than equity markets, and it means that as more and more assets go digital, that's going to have to be rethought. Because at the end of the day, rehypothecation isn't necessarily evil. It simply needs to be tracked, understood, and used for the right purposes. Market makers, for example, often borrow rehypothecated stock in the equity world. And in crypto, it could be the same way. It's simply a question of knowing who is selling, do they have the ability to make good deliveries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that everything is ticked and tied with contract and transparent. Now, I've seen other criticisms of the bill arguing that it doesn't allow and requires KYC on the part of personal wallets, which seems a little bit strict, but I'll let that one play out. The reality is, it is okay in my mind to have KYC when it's a financial intermediary, an exchange, or a broker that is actually taking in the customer fund flow, helping them execute orders. So if a wallet platform allows individual wallets, but gives them a mechanism for selling coins and getting dollars back into a bank account, yes, I think that could be needs to be KYC. But if it is a platform that allows crypto to crypto sales, one can make an argument that it probably shouldn't. We'll let that one play out. If it's stable coins, it's probably somewhere in between. Not my biggest issue, but it is absolutely important. Now, what matters about this particular bill is that we now have both the House and the Senate. So all it's going to take is pressure in order to get people talking. Now, will this happen in an election year? Probably not. Will it happen, this year before the election year? Probably not. But maybe the narrative shift is forcing things. So, talking about narrative shift, what's the next story? Well, now we have a House member, Richie Torres, doing something very interesting. He sent letters specifically criticizing and calling into question the relationship between the SEC and Prometheum, which was this sham where they tried to make the argument, we don't need new rules to regulate crypto. In point of fact, what Mr. Torres said was fascinating in that letter. He talked about the fact that the SEC regulates by enforcement, and I'll let you read it. It's put up here in the infographic. But the fact of the matter is, it shows that it's not just Republicans being critical of the SEC's kind of two-faced declaration that, well, we have enough rules to prosecute, but we understand we don't have enough rules to actually regulate and move the market forward, which really is what's going on here. And there have been multiple conversations over the last couple of days about this. Mark Cuban had a great thread on this as well, where he said more or less the same thing. The last piece of news I want to talk about is really a set of news. It's more on the Bitcoin ETF narrative, and that is continuing to change and push the politics of the situation. Because with all of this as a backdrop, with the courts and with Congress, we still have things going on. So Fidelity quietly amended their ETF filing, as have many others over the past week, to effectively resemble the BlackRock filing, naming Coinbase as the market of sufficient size. I had it confirmed to me by a reporter friend that inside the filings, while it's not talked about, in addition to surveillance sharing agreements, there's also the implication that Coinbase would respond in the affirmative if the SEC or the CFTC came to them and said, who did this suspicious trade? Now, that information sharing agreement is a big deal because it makes it almost identical to the way that equity ETFs are surveilled. And in fact, the other place where I am hoping that Gary Gensler is as smart as I think he is that he uses this to take a victory lap. Now, I talked about this last week, but I want it to be very clear. In a world where he's just been slapped down, where he's essentially been awarded the ability to go after funds or firms who use crypto to fundraise to institutions directly, but he loses the entire secondary trading aspect of his case. He can claim to have gained surveillance over Bitcoin by having the Bitcoin ETF, claiming at that point, probably truthfully actually, that his difficulty, his stubbornness has resulted in gaining a level of trust where the SEC can actually be that cop on the beat. Now, will they find manipulation? Probably not. Will they be able to do anything particularly important with this? Probably not. But politically, it's an incredible thing to be able to say that he got the jurisdiction he was looking for and he's able to protect investors. But the flip side is if he somehow stays so stubborn that he says, it's not good enough, then he's going to have to answer for a very simple fact. How is it that an ETF that he approved, backed on futures, has underperformed Bitcoin spot by over 30% since he approved it? And by the way, by the time the presidential election comes around, that number is going to likely be much higher. So he's going to have to explain to voters how he pushed them to a dramatically inferior product versus one that would have had much better returns. I think that's going to be a very hard sell for him. And I think that that is a massive political liability. And just as we predicted, and it was obvious it was going to happen, if you look at the oil ETF, it's underperformed oil by well over 90% over the years. The fact of the matter is he approved products that are not nearly as good for retail investors. And by doing so, he has a problem. So his argument, him taking a victory lap here, saying, well, I needed to hold out to get this, actually gives him the ability to declare a win. Otherwise, it's going to be a very big loss. And that loss is going to cost his bosses if it is not resolved. So with that, I'll leave you on the happy news that the market is starting to resolve itself in a reasonable manner. Volumes are certainly up, but be very careful. There is no way to think that any of this news means an immediate wave of speculative buying. What it means is people who were afraid to buy tokens because they thought that they were going to be forced to sell them due to litigation can now do their research and buy in the long run. It means that Bitcoin investors are one step closer to being able to have other investors who don't have the ability or the wherewithal to do self-custody or don't want to trade on third-party crypto exchanges that they can't do out of their brokerage accounts. It means that a lot of money can enter the space, but not that it's going into the space. And summing this up was interesting this morning was Larry Fink, who on another CNBC report once again reiterated that crypto is going to revolutionize finance. Now, he clearly also believes in digital gold, but he also believes in digital assets writ large. And we'll talk about it probably next week about AIs. I didn't have a chance to talk about the AI implications of this, but there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, mostly that entrepreneurship might be getting a chance to flourish again in the United States. It might take another year or two, but at least we're seeing the signs, and that's good. So enjoy the rest of your weekend and stay safe out there, everyone.